Thank you for having me.
Always,
it's a pleasure
always
to be here.
Definitely a pleasure. So let's begin, obviously, in an attempt to somewhat justify the tariffs, right? U.S. is one of Nigeria's most important trade partners. We now have seen these tariffs. So just to provide some sort of backdrop on the balance of trade and the existing relationship before now.
U.S. is the top two global traders, import-exporters in the world, U.S., China. U.S. is the top importer. China is the top exporter. So in relation to Nigeria, the U.S. is one of Nigeria's top trading partners. However, if you flip that, you would see that Nigeria is not a top trading partner for the U.S. So if you want to look at the U.S. overall trade, the total trade of the U.S. is about 0.3%. Nigeria accounts for just 0.3% of the U.S.'s total trade. Its top partners are Canada, Mexico, Japan, Germany, China, of course, and all of those. But with Nigeria, you will see that over 90% of Nigeria's trade with the U.S. is oil, crude oil. Crude oil exports, the U.S. imports crude oil from Nigeria, and then about 8% of the rest is fertilizer, non-oil exports, about 8%. So you see that for the U.S., Nigeria is not so much of a target, even because remember the tariff for a blanket tariff for the entire world.
Right.
The target is China. However, for Nigeria, the U.S. is a top trading partner, though with oil. The impact on oil is not much. Why do I say not much? Because there are no tariffs on oil. However, with the global shake-off or shake-down of these blanket tariffs, with the trade war with China, it does impact our oil revenues, our oil trade, but with the non-oil exports. Some people may argue that the overall impact is negligible because it accounts for less than 1% impact on the economy. However, there are a large number of people in the non-oil sector who will be impacted by this. And moreover, Nigeria is developing her non-oil exports. The statistics have been improving. And so this is not a very good time for that sector to be hit with policies like this.
The timing is off, right?
Yes, for non-oil sector, yes. For the diversification of our exports in the non-oil, the timing is kind of off.
And we'll probably get to that later, but from what you've said so far, would you say we have built or we have some level of dependence on American demand?
I would say that, definitely. I'd say that.
So that's going to have a significant impact on the non-oil?
Absolutely. On the non-oil, even on the oil, yes, it will have.
So how would you say that these tariffs perhaps undermine the competitiveness of Nigerian goods in the U.S. market? What's your assessment of that? And do local manufacturers and exporters, do you think it's time they begin to rethink their strategy to position themselves at some sort of trade advantage globally?
So Nigerian goods in the U.S. market, we're speaking specifically non-oil. Yeah, because the oils, the crude, they've not been impacted by the tariffs.
Right.
So yes, there's going to be an impact because they enjoy the benefits of the Growth and Opportunity Act, where they enjoy duty-free trade in the U.S. And so they've been enjoying that. A lot of SMEs have built their business on that Opportunity Act, where there's no tariff on their goods. The shea butter, as you mentioned, the ginger, the cocoa, the fertilizer, the agricultural products. Some have manufactured agricultural products. Those industries, that sector is going to be hugely affected because they're no longer going to be as competitive. So the U.S. importers are very likely going to pivot to more competitive producers, which is the goal for the U.S. But it's going to affect us. The pivot to cheaper options, less expensive options within the U.S. and other trade partners who are doing that. So yes, it's going to affect them. Those SMEs or those businesses that have built their business model on the Opportunity Act, the agreement, are going to have to try to take costs cut costs. They're going to have to search for new markets, although that may be difficult. It's not so easy for SMEs, especially, to pivot to find new markets, especially having built their business on an agreement that they thought would last for a very long time. So yes, there are going to be some impacts, but they can diversify their partners. But again, that's not so easy to do, especially if they're micro businesses, they're smallest. It's not so easy to find alternative trade partners, but it's possible to diversify, especially right now under the African Continental Free Trade
Agreement
area. I think that it's time for these SMEs to start to look closer home, because the AFCFTA is going to offer almost duty-free trade, as long as, and you know, a lot of these SMEs are producing goods that are fully homegrown, so it's going to meet the rules of origin caveats, and so there's a market there. I think that the SMEs will probably need government support to try to pivot towards trading within Africa and then maybe Latin America and other parts. So
there are opportunities, right, despite the measured impact that you have highlighted, but looking at the wider impact on the economy, you're saying to stay competitive, they may have to bring their prices down.
Yes.
How does that ripple down to the economy, jobs, and all of that?
So in that sector, people will be impacted. But if you want to look at it look at the macro economy, the impact may be negligible, but we can't just conclude that it's negligible, because there are going to be a number of people. I mean, the non-oil exports to the U.S. is about 500. It's a 500 billion, economy. That's what it's worth, about 0.44 trillion. So that's about less than 500 billion. So there's a huge chunk of people who are going to going to lose their jobs. They're going to be it's going to affect a number of people there. And again, I mentioned that that's a sector that's trying to drive Nigeria's diversification efforts, especially in non-oil. So it's a baby that we should be babying that sector, and right now it's going to be hit hard. So we need to pay attention to it, despite the school of thought that the impact is negligible to the wider economy. However, speaking about the tariffs, the trade wars, it's not negligible. The impact is not negligible on the wider economy.
Yeah, and obviously we've spoken to some degree to the larger non-oil exports, but let's speak specifically to sectors. Are there particular sectors that will be more affected? Fertilizers, for example, some will be surprised to hear that we do export fertilizers to the US, especially after the Russia-Ukraine war. That woke us up a bit more. So are there specific sectors that will be more affected by these tariffs?
You brought up fertilizers. Yes, because fertilizers have been hit with this right now 10% tariffs. We don't know if in 90 days we'll be back to 14%, but 10% is something worth it. But I think that the fertilizer industry has huge potential to take this shock, because, for example, the Dangote fertilizer plant actually built its reports are that that plant is built based on the high demand from the U.S. market, which right now is going to be affected. But I think we have the Indians, who are huge importers of fertilizer. We have Brazil, and even China. China imports and exports. So there's market for fertilizer. And not just that there's a market, pivoting will be easier for Nigeria, because we have a cost advantage. We can leverage on the low cost of producing fertilizer in Nigeria because of our gas. Because we have gas. So I think that the cost implications, the losses for the fertilizer industry may not be so much. I think that they can easily bounce back. I also need to mention that there's an African market for fertilizers, not just India and Brazil and Latin America. So again, the AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, comes up as an opportunity for the fertilizer sector to pivot towards there. But we have solid minerals that this whole shake-up is an opportunity for us to start to develop.
Alake has said one or two things about the mining sector and partnerships to aid growth in that sector. But let's still look at the impact. Are there any specifics as regards the numbers, just how much is at risk or how much we stand to lose here with these tariffs, proposed tariffs, right? And in addition to that, looking at the price of oil is going down, the threat that is doing to our budgets and our revenues and all of that, how that could have a ripple effect on FX, how that could have a ripple effect on inflation. So just give us some insight into that.
Okay, so when the news first came out, the Liberation Day news, when it was broken, there was a lot of uncertainty, economic uncertainty, and as a result, investors were not making moves. There was a lot of capital outflow, and as a result, the oil price, because oil prices responds to the global economy, responds to global economic growth or global economic demand for oil. Almost everything. It's a long ripple effect. So oil prices responded by dip. I think 7%, but specifically from, I think about 85%, $85 per barrel, I think, between the beginning of this year or April, it has come down to, when the news first broke, about 60. And then when the 60, so when the pullback, the pause, when President Trump announced the pause, the prices came up to, I think, 63 that you mentioned. So it's very volatile. That market is very volatile. Now, for Nigeria, that is a huge deal. That's because we are very highly dependent on oil trade for our export revenues, for government revenues. So there's a huge impact for Nigeria's macroeconomy. Now, how does that happen? First of all, with the fall in prices, oil prices, our revenues fall. And I think this is a good time to bring in the budget, our budget that was set with an ambitious $75 per barrel, and right now it's under 65. So even with that 75, there was a 13 trillion deficit. So we can expect that there'll be further deficits. And even His Excellency, the Honorable Minister, had mentioned that, had alluded to the fact that they have to go back to the drawing board because the deficits are going to dip. They're going to be wider than the 13 trillion. That's because of the reduced forex earnings for Nigeria. Yeah.
Where does the government look now, right? Because it's evident that somewhat the revenues are going to be affected.
Yeah.
Some people are saying tax, even though, Nigerians wouldn't be too happy with that. So where does the government look now to boost their revenues and supplement their budget some way?
Tax is good. Tax is partial. Yeah, tax is good. Tax is partial, but tax won't fix our problems right now. Tax is it's a long-term approach, especially when done well. We have a good tax, relatively good tax plan, but we don't know yet about implementation, right? So we can't even start to think to fall back on tax. Tax will put us, if the implementation is good, it will put us on a good trajectory to make us Nigeria attractive to investors. It will help to make us diversify the government revenue earnings away from oil, and all of that is good. But in the short run, in the midst of the trade wars, I mean, it may be borrowing, I'm afraid to say.
Yes, you said that shakily, because more
borrowing, sadly,
And the ripple effects on inflation
yes, back, they're huge. But the thing with borrowing is that you have to think about the sustainability and the management. I think we also, as a nation, I think what we need to do is to manage expenses, cut down. So as they go back to the drawing board on the budget, there's some capital projects or some projects that are non-essential projects can be cut down on, can be completely removed. So that budget has to be checked. And as the Monetary Policy Authority, as the CBN look into managing this, I think it's also important that they manage it in a slow pace, not just sharp dips. Because sharp dips affect the domestic economy, shocks FX shocks affect the domestic economy, it affects all of us, it affects investors. So it's important that naturally with this whole dip in oil earnings, the truth is a depreciation is expected. But if this depreciation occurs like slowly,
Right.
it's the truth. We just have to deal with it.
Yes.
That's why the tariff was a problem for the world.
Right. So hopefully we get some sort of soft landing with everything that's happening. But it's a pleasure to have you join us and share your perspective. Dr. Adesewa Eredewa, a senior Adesewa Eredewa, a senior research fellow, International Economic Relations Division, Nigeria Institute of International Affairs. She's also the coordinator of the Bashir Adeniyi Center for International Trade and Investment. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much for having me.